Look, I think when talking about Gaza, there are a couple of things that happen. The first thing is to say, let's not forget that 76% of people in this country want a ceasefire. And not one of our primary politicians is calling for that. Not one. And that suggests there's a profound disconnect between our senior politicians and the people they are supposed to govern, or govern in our name at least. I think the use of abuse generally, including anti-Semitism, to try and ridicule those who want to see peace in Palestine and in Israel, is taking a very serious issue of racism and discrimination, an issue that I faced in my life, an issue that led to my mother, a Holocaust survivor, having to live for 3.5 years in a coal cellar. And every time there was a raid in the area, she was rolled into a carpet and the carpet put up against the wall. She lost dozens of her family in Auschwitz, where I've lectured on genocide. I've spent the last 22 plus years writing, making films about, talking about the global arms trade, about conflict, about genocide. I lectured at Auschwitz for the Auschwitz Institute and have written for them about genocide prevention. And because I care deeply for humanity, and I do not want to see an incredibly powerful military state slaughtering over 35,000 people who are defenseless, to be called an anti-Semite, given my personal and family history, it's really important that people understand how hurtful that is. And I even had someone saying to me, and they claimed to be a rabbi, saying to me on social media, well, your mother must have been a capo if she survived the war, a Nazi collaborator. And you, of course, are following in her footsteps. That is the worst thing you can say to a Jewish person. And the astonishing thing is that sometimes it's even Jews saying those things. And one has to filter out the bots and all of that nonsense that crowd our social media and pile on. But when you see actual individuals saying things like this, you worry what has happened to our humanity. You worry about how completely insensitive people have become. And also the sort of logic that suggests that you are only a Jew if you hold certain political views. In my first ever speech in Parliament in South Africa, this guy from the party of apartheid, the National Party, started shouting at me in Afrikaans, "You communist, you communist." And I've never been a member of the South African Communist Party in my life. And eventually I looked at him and I said, "Why are you shouting at me like this?" And he said, "Well, you're white and you're Jewish and you're part of the ANC, so obviously you're a communist." That was anti-Semitic, and he was kicked out of the chamber and suspended as a consequence. But people do that all the time in this country at the moment. And I don't know who appointed them the deity, that they are able to redefine who is and isn't a proper Jew on the basis of somebody's political views. Because unfortunately, that's simply not true. And so one of the things I want this campaign to do is to show people that it's acceptable for people to talk out in support of the Palestinian people, that it's acceptable to be critical of the state of Israel, that is not being critical of Jewish people. The state of Israel behaves in certain ways that I find abominable.
And a warm and hearty welcome to our independent parliamentary candidate, Mr. Andrew Feinstein.
We talked a lot about Palestine and what's happened, the suffering that's going on there, but there's not as much said about what happened on October the 7th. And people criticise our letters pages, criticise our coverage sometimes. What would you say to that?
I think it's incredibly important that as human beings, we feel, obviously, for the people killed, for the people captured, for their families, their loved ones, their communities, we feel sympathy and empathy. If we can't feel that, we have lost our humanity. And it doesn't decrease your sympathy or your empathy for those human beings because you understand the political context in which that happened. The reality is that Gaza and Palestine has been under a brutal occupation for many, many decades. So to describe what happened on October 7th as an unprovoked incident tends to ignore the context. That doesn't excuse it, that doesn't make our sympathy or our empathy any less. And you know, on all of the platforms I speak at, I speak about all of the tragic events of Israel and Palestine. And I think we need to have that context. It's important to understand that the ever-rocketing amounts that we spend on defense, that we subsidize our weapons-making companies with, to sell weapons into these various conflicts, this is money that I think could be put to much better use for a lot of the real human security issues that face us, the climate catastrophe, issues like housing, benefits, wages, the requirement of new investment in the NHS, and all of those other things. So these issues aren't separate, they're really closely linked. And this campaign is going to talk about all of those issues.
Is this a local campaign just here, or is it? I mean, you don't want to prevent a Labour government. You just want to prevent Keir Starmer from being the Prime Minister? Or?
Well, let me be quite frank on that matter. I think anybody who understands anything about politics will know that the chances of the Tories staying in government are virtually zero at this point. I mean, they've been so incompetent, so inept, some would argue so corrupt for so long, that I think there is quite clearly a mood to get rid of them in the country generally. But you don't want to replace one Conservative government with another Conservative government. You want a government that is going to be about real change and that is going to focus on the majority of people in this country who do need support and assistance from a strong, competent, accountable central and local government. And that's what I want. And, you know, unfortunately, through his politics, Keir Starmer has given so many indications that he might not be the best person to lead a transformational government in this country. And that's what the country needs, a transformational government, not business as usual, not just changing the tie of the guy in the suit at the dispatch box from blue to red.
Was it not the job of people to kind of stay in the Labour Party and if you're left-wing and win the argument, and if you want a left-wing manifesto, that's where it was going to come from?
I think it was made very clear to us that we were not welcome, first of all. Second of all, that our ideas, if they were what we could broadly call progressive, had no place in Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And, you know, I've had to make this sort of decision before. I resigned from Parliament on a matter of principle because of massive political corruption by my own party, which I'd been involved with since my late teens. And that was an incredibly difficult thing to do. And people said to me, why don't you stay on and try and change things from within? Well, because it was made absolutely clear to me that if I stayed on, I would never be able to speak out about corruption in the ANC. I could talk about it in other parties or corruption in our government. So there would have been no point in me staying on. So by doing this, I resigned from the Labour Party, not very long ago actually, primarily about Gaza, but generally about Keir Starmer's very restrictive and authoritarian leadership. And I want to give people in this constituency an alternative, an option that is fundamentally different to what Keir Starmer's Labour Party is going to offer at the next election. And there's almost the possibility that this could be a local campaign, and it will be grounded as a local campaign, but it might have some national impact. And perhaps if we see politicians around the country getting elected because the community trusts them, because their eyes haven't been lit up by the prospect of huge donations from incredibly wealthy people, but who really want to serve their constituents.